Welcome everybody to another edition of Coffee and Open Source, a place to meet some new friends, have some great conversation, and maybe learn something along the way. And I'm your host, Isaac Levin. If you're enjoying the interviews here, be sure to like, subscribe, follow wherever you're watching or listening. Also, if you're interested or know any folks that would be interested in coming on having a chat, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter. My handle there is IsaacR11. All right, so with that out of the way, I got some coffee, and I'm excited for my guest today because I have a guest that has the same name as me, which is awesome. My guest today is Isaac Z. Schlueter. Isaac, do you want to say hello? Introduce yourself.
Hello, I'm Isaac. I made NPM, done a bunch of stuff on Node and in open source JavaScript. Now I'm doing another startup.
Awesome. Well, again, thank you so much for being on the show, and I think we'll have a good amount of opportunity to chat about NPM. But I want to start out with your tech origin story. I love to have these sort of conversations. Like, do you remember a point in time in your life, maybe you were younger, maybe it was, later when you were in high school or whatever, an opportunity where tech came across you and you're just like, this is it. I love computers. I like the idea of building things, and this is what I want to work on.
Yeah, I think for me, the kind of the aha moment was when I was in high school. And we used, this was like, back in the olden days when nobody had iPhones and stuff, we used TI-82 calculators for my math and physics classes. Mm-hmm. And I realized that I could just program in all of the equations for my physics test and then get an A on the test by just punching in the numbers for each problem. And I had a interesting experience where I got there was a physics test I had. I finished it in 5 minutes and handed it in. And when the teacher handed them all back, there was just written in red, see me.
Sure.
And I was like, and the teacher was like, okay, how did you get all of these answers? Where did you get the answers from? I'm like, oh, I just used my calculator. She was like, you have to show your work though. I was like, but there's no work to show. Look, I just punch in the number and then it gives me the answer. And she was like, kind of skeptical. I was like, I wrote this program using the calculator. I should be allowed to use it. Mm-hmm. She's like, oh, you wrote this program. All right, well, that's fine. But, don't share it with anybody else.
Yeah.
And I had already shared it with most of my class.
Everybody. Yeah.
Right. So, and then I realized people all of a sudden, I was just nerdy, nerdy, super awkward spectrum kid in high school and didn't have a ton of friends. But all of a sudden I was super popular. I was like, oh, I could just write code and then I'll get people liking me and wanting things from me and wanting to give me things. I think I could maybe do this for a job.
Yeah. That's it's so funny, the calculator story. I remember I took linear algebra in high school, and literally there was a function in these TI-80 calculators where it's solve matrices. You just put in like the matrices and hit a button and it would solve it. And I remember I
Hmm.
figured that I found this and I was like, oh, this is pretty cool, but all quite dangerous. And I showed a friend, and within an hour, every single person in the class is doing this, and the teacher was not super excited because there was obviously some kids that could have probably used to learn, linear algebra instead of just cheating, or not cheating, but using a tool to do it. But I'm of the belief that tools solve all of our problems, and typically anyway. There's not a lot of opportunities where we actually have to like use our brain without anything else to solve problems. But I do love the story about that. Were you kind of interested in the software side only, or did you kind of get like, were you interested in like building computers and things like that during, that time frame in the 90s where you could start building computers and such?
Um, yeah, I definitely was very into hardware, and went to school. I went to college and did kind of an interdisciplinary major in computer science, physics, and math.
Okay.
Um, and I had sort of intended to go into more of the like low level like hardware type stuff. Um, electricity and electronics is just like it's just a super fascinating field, and like all of the stuff around like solid state physics and stuff is just like mind-bogglingly awesome. Um, and what I found when I got out of college, I have moved across the country, and while I was moving across the country, the dot-com bubble just popped, and I found myself, with no job prospects and no money. Um, so like going to grad school was kind of out of the question.
Sure.
And you can learn new programming languages with just like a computer and a crummy internet connection. You don't need like access to a lab to do stuff with hardware. Um, so at the time in like 2002, um, I just sort of got more and more into open source because it was accessible, because it was available. I didn't have to like do more schooling in order to
Right.
do it. I could just kind of be productive right away. And yeah, and now here we are 20 years later, and have spent this time here. I don't think I'm ever going back to grad school.
Yeah,
So
yeah, I
I'm
mean, at this point, I think there might be some
pretty far
question of
down
like,
that path.
yeah, like what are you going to learn in grad school, right? Like I think that might be the biggest question. It's like, oh, like the problems that I've already kind of solved building some of these very, very well-known frameworks, like am I going to get something additional from going to school? Like sure, you might have an opportunity to do some interesting research, maybe as you look getting a
Yeah, yeah.
master's and stuff like that. Um, but I've always kind of been interesting of like you kind of have to stay in the academic world if you want to go down that route, or you kind of get like a solve business problems for money sort of job, right? Like those are kind of like the two career paths out of our field, and it's always interesting to see like who wants to stay in that, who wants to kind of immediately start making money and so forth, right? And open source is kind of like that meet in the middle sort of, I guess, sort of juncture.
Hmm.
I would love to, when I looked into kind of your history and looking at some of the companies you work for, and one of the things I would love to kind of talk to you about, like you worked at Yahoo for a little bit, and like
Yep.
during that time, like late 2000 aughts, like Yahoo was, I guess you could say, very very large, but also not as large as some of the other tech companies they directly competed with. Like, how was that experience for you working at Yahoo? It looks like you worked on a bunch of different teams there, and you worked there for a good
Hmm.
amount of time. Like, what was your experience there? And, do you have anything to take away from that?
Yeah. Yahoo. I mean, Yahoo in the like, around that time. Let's see, I was there from about 2006 until 2010. And I mean, when I came to Yahoo, I mean, they were massive. They were
Yeah.
like, um, essentially like a digital media, massive player in that space. And I think Google got bigger than Yahoo while I was there, or maybe they
Yeah.
already were, but they were definitely kind of the newer thing. Facebook was, I believe, founded while I was at Yahoo, so that they weren't really a competitor for a while. But yeah, I definitely learned a lot just from like cranking out websites and working on stuff that got, humongous amounts of traffic, like, literally billions of people accessing the Yahoo webpage
Yeah.
every day. And yeah, I don't know, definitely, sharpened my JavaScript and kind of general programming skills while I was there, and hopped around between a lot of different teams. I kind of got a reputation as somebody who could like come in and make a front end framework for some new media property and just kind of be productive pretty quickly. The the main thing I usually focused on was just like, what is the dev experience of spinning up this website, and how do we make that better? And
Sure.
you know, um, yeah, I don't know. I didn't stay on any one team. I was on the games team initially, and I didn't really stay on any one team for long enough to feel like super attached to any of the products we built. But
Sure.
I did work on a couple of cool things.
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to think what was like the go-to JavaScript framework during that time. Like I think my first foray into JavaScript frameworks was Dojo, which I don't think they even exist anymore. Like what
Yeah,
kind of frameworks were you
Dojo,
working in? Yeah, go ahead.
Dojo, and Mood Tools, I think, were both pretty big. But the big dominant players were jQuery and YUI.
Yeah, it's funny.
So
I just
YUI obviously
yeah.
at Yahoo was the one we used for everything.
Yeah, I just always forget about jQuery for some reason. Like even though it's still used to this day for almost everything, it's for some reason I just don't think of it as a framework in the same way I think of like current frameworks like your Angular, Vue, React, Svelte, Next, all that sort of stuff, right? What was it
Yeah, well,
about?
I mean,
Yeah, go ahead.
JavaScript frameworks then were strictly client side, right? There
Yeah,
was no real server side JS to speak of, um, and certainly not anything that would do any kind of DOM manipulation or anything. And it was, I think that the state of kind of browsers and network speeds just wasn't there to support things like React and Vue.
hmm
Um, and so, yeah, all of your JavaScript frameworks were strictly front end frameworks.
yeah. And also seems like during that time too, like at least from my visibility, like jQuery was literally just to add sort of responsiveness to already existing UIs too, right? Like I think your point about the entire application being written in JavaScript, then you have like this idea of the single page application, right? Like I feel like that was something that came out probably in the late 20 aughts, and obviously in the 2010s, like they spun up like crazy.
Yeah,
Well, yeah,
the big paradigm shift there, I think, was Google Maps.
yeah,
When that came out, that was really one of the first like large feels like a native program, but it's running in a web browser
hmm
kind of thing, and was just doing impossible stuff like this the like forever scrolling map tiles
sure,
type of behavior, and doing that all with like prefetching tiles asynchronously in the background and stuff, which now is again like it's all kind of table stakes and old
yeah.
hat. There's like a million different ways to do it, but at the time it required a lot of pretty brutal hacks.
Yeah, I remember I vividly remember seeing like Google Maps and obviously then Google Earth, which is written in a different technology, but still like the idea of like free unlimited experiences doing whatever you want, right? Being able to do it inside of a browser is just absolutely absurd to me at the time, right? What was it about JavaScript that interested you so much? Because I think it's fair to say you've been pretty attached to JavaScript for most of your professional career.
Yeah, there's I feel like you can there's obviously a lot of different ways to kind of like categorize or create like taxonomies of programming languages, and this is a very you know tired subject, I guess. But one way that I kind of like to divide them is into like uh, languages that are trying to be correct and languages that are trying to get shit done. And JavaScript is very firmly in that second category.
Sure.
Oh, I don't know if you're allowing to
No,
if
no,
you
it's
allow cursing on there. You
don't
might have to
worry. We're
put
good.
me on a mute
The,
delay or something. Uh,
we're
this
good.
is,
We're good.
um, and you know, like proponents of the correct languages would say, oh, well, you know, it's better to get shit done in a language that's correct. And like, okay, sure, yeah, blah blah blah. But like, how hard is it to go from, you know, from zero to hello world in a language that requires you to like strictly and statically type everything, and you're only allowed one variable and everything has to be a pure function and there's no side effects, and it's like I just want to write hello world to the term. Can you just like get out of
Yeah.
my freaking way, you know? um and you know, on the one hand you've got languages like you know, like Haskell, like to a certain extent TypeScript, most actual like statically typed, strongly typed languages are kind of in that like be correct side
Yep.
of things. Um, and most pure functional languages for sure. On the other side of that spectrum, you've got languages that are like, screw it, like just coerce the types, it's fine.
Sure. Sure.
You know, languages like Bash and PHP and JavaScript, um, and even you know, if you kind of kick it the right way, C is kind of like this, right? Like, yeah, it's got types, but it's also got void pointers, and you can call them. So,
Yeah. Whenever
you
you have
know,
access to
how
like,
strongly typed is it?
yeah, whenever you have access to like modify, manipulate memory, like nothing really matters, right? Like at the end of the day.
Right. It's basically, I mean, C is basically a get shit done scripting language for your memory in your computer and your CPU. And so yeah, I think that the I've always found that I'm much more drawn to learning languages kind of haptically, right? By like I can read a book about a programming language and it'll stick. Like I've sat down and read language specs. I think it's a great thing to do. I recommend that people who are like getting into web development, like, you know, print out the JavaScript, the ECMAScript specification. It's long, it's dense,
Yeah.
but like,
It's a page turner if you want to go to sleep for sure.
yeah, like, but just like print it out and don't worry about understanding every word. Just put all those words in your brain. And like what'll happen then is you'll be like, oh, hey, I remember something about this. Or every once in a while you'll be like, oh, that was that bug I had that time. And that's why it was doing that weird thing. Um, and you'll remember kind of where to go and look it up. But I feel like the real, you know, if you kind of like design a program in a vacuum or like on a whiteboard or just in your head, like you don't really know it until you like do it, right?
Yeah.
Until like you actually are touching reality with it. And so you know, I've always found myself much more drawn to these kinds of languages that are very much like just
Yeah.
like you can get up and moving very very quickly, with as little ceremony as possible. And so I found my way to JavaScript by way of uh, oh gosh, what did I do before then? Well, everything in college was C and C++. And then when I got out of school, I got a job at a VB6 shop. So it was a client server application where the client was like an MSIE 6 kind of wrapper, right? It was just a Visual Basic app that had a big web
Yeah.
browser control. The only thing they added to it was tabs and some special functions because Ajax didn't exist yet that would like let you send. They called it server calls.
Sure.
And so basically, what you could do is like it would open an iframe, like a 1 pixel off-screen iframe, and then post some data into it,
Yeah.
and then wait on the response from the server to kind of do this like backdoor like send data to the server thing.
The horrible things that were done to make like server client interoperability just work, right?
Right, right.
Yeah.
But the client was all just MSIE, and the server was a VB6 ASP stack. So the kind of nice thing about it was like it was one language. Unfortunately, that language was Visual Basic, but it was one language from end to end because we were writing all the client stuff in VBScript. The ASP pages were all VBScript, and then the DLLs were, the compiled bits were all VB6, which is kind of like, you know, you had to kind of know which world you were in, but you didn't have to do quite as much context switching in that way. And yeah, and then I got to, you know, when I got out of there and I started doing more stuff with like open source and especially at Yahoo, it's like we have like PHP on the server and you have JavaScript on the client.
Yep.
Which are both like C-ish enough. They're like both algos, you know, you can kind of translate. But yeah, I mean, I was sort of like, well, you know, we can't put PHP in the browser anytime soon.
Sure.
And there's a lot of things that are just baked into the PHP language that make it very tied to a server-side environment. Whereas JavaScript, like JavaScript could probably run anywhere. And then when V8 was open source, like that was a big, you know, get kind of for the server-side JS world. I'd actually started getting into trying to figure out how to do server-side JavaScript a couple of months before V8 got open sourced, just working on SpiderMonkey. And yeah, then V8 came out, and there was a whole bunch of activity around that. Obviously, that kind of ended up sort of coalescing around Node, which was sort of the dominant server-side JS platform for a pretty long time. And now we've got others. We got Dino and Cloudflare and Lambda workers and this new one, Bun, that seems kind of interesting.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. I think one thing that's you mentioned a couple of things that I'd love to kind of just call out and double click on, like the whole like get shit done thing with JavaScript, right? Like, you know, everybody who cares is familiar with kind of the origin story of JavaScript, right? Like it was very, very small. Like the idea was very, very small and it was written very, very quickly. And then stuff was just added on top of it over the course of time into what it is now, which I think is very interesting because most of, I guess, the current climate for, you know, software development is built on top of 10 days of work initially, right? And then you mentioned something that I think is also very, very interesting from a juxtaposition standpoint, like how JavaScript, like initially there's like no ceremony. And I think now today, when people think about JavaScript, building JavaScript applications in like some of these well-known frameworks, there is quite a lot of ceremony, right?
There is, yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to kind of get your thoughts as like, obviously I don't want to get into like a bashing browser frameworks or JavaScript frameworks, but I think like, where does like the ceremony become a challenge, right? Like, because there are all these frameworks that their sole job is to just make things easier, but you also have to add, you know, 17 files and, you know, all these lines of boilerplate code, and you have to bring in these package.json files. We'll talk about that, obviously, that download like 400 megabytes of files just to run it. And if it's hello world, right? Or if it's an Express app, even more, right? Like, I'd love to kind of get your thoughts on like how JavaScript went from, like you said, like no ceremony required to the utmost ceremony required.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. How did JavaScript lose our way? I mean, my goal is always to kind of like try to get back to that, just like, can I just like write a program and then run it and that's how it works? Yeah. You know, or like ship the browser stuff. So I mean, initially in Node, like my own kind of contribution to this excess of ceremony, so let me back up a step. There's always been some amount of ceremony, right? Like, sure. Even if you're using jQuery, if you want to use any kind of like, you know, or if you're using like jQuery or YUI or Dojo back in the day, it's like, okay, well, I'm using jQuery and that's cool. Like that gives me just like a really tight little kernel of like a bunch of functionality. Yep. I've got a $sign object and I can do stuff with it. But let's say I want to use a button component and I want to like reuse that component throughout my site. And let's say I want to use a component that you built, not one that I built. So in order to do that, I'd have to go with jQuery UI, which now it's like, okay, now I've got a build step.
Yep.
Or if I don't have a build step, I have to know and manually manage which script tags I'm putting in my website. The more script tags I put, the slower my site gets, because now it has to do a bunch of extra HTTP stuff. So, I want to kind of combine and minify all of that stuff. And like, yeah, like now you have ceremony. You have ceremony whether you like it or not. So then the question becomes like, how do I make that as kind of as minimal as possible? YUI 3 had tried a bunch of things to try and make this better. The one of the ways that jQuery and YUI tried to do this is by having like an online thing where you can go and tick the boxes for which components you use. It would ship you like a optimized script that you could just drop in your site and it would work. And so Node came around and I was like, great. Like, I've been hacking on server-side JS stuff, and I want to be able to like build my own website. Here's this guy, Ryan Dahl, who seems to know how to make a web server, made a really fast one and hooked it up to a JavaScript API. Like I want it. Like I want to use this thing. But I did not want to, and this is, I guess, getting into the kind of origin story of NPM. So I didn't want to have to like, reinvent the entire internet from first principles every time I want to make a website, right? Like, Node is a very low level platform. And it was like, you get a request object that has some details about the request. You get a response object. You use that to send the response. That's it. And I'm like, okay, but like, I just want to like know if a user's logged in or not. Like, I don't even want like, now I got to juggle like set cookie headers and I have to read their cookie and parse it and see if it's valid. Like, can I just do all that in one place to have a nice little thingy I can just hook in and call like check cookie request response or whatever. So there was definitely a little bit of buzz and scramble and like a bunch of kind of ideas all getting pitched about how to build like a web framework on top of Node, right? That would let you like have these pluggable middleware layers. And also I was like, okay, so I had one of those that was kind of loosely based on this other server-side JS platform called Narwhal and a spec called JSGI. You don't need to know what those things are. They're dead. But it was kind of based on WSGI from Python.
Okay.
And at the same time, this other guy, TJ Holloway-Chuck, and Tim Caswell were kind of working on this different approach, which is a little bit more based on Sinatra from Ruby, where you have, like app.post, and then you give it a path or a pattern, and it would like figure out which routes to call which functions, and you could have these middleware things that you stack in there. Well, I realized like, okay, well, if everybody's going to be like, if I'm going to have this like platform for like stacking up all of these JSGI, components on top of one another, then how, like, I don't have to write all of those. And I don't want to go through the trouble of what was happening on the Node mailing list of like, every time somebody wrote some new module, they'd send a message. It's like, hey, check out this thing. You do like git clone Isaac/foo. And then you have to like also pull this other submodule and put it in the deps folder and symlink this thing to that place. And then it just works. And I was like, yeah, no, that sucks. That is a pain in the ass. So what I did was I wrote a little, basically a port of a bash script that I had, that I'd been using in the past when I was at Yahoo, that would kind of abstract between using RPM or YInst. And I extended that and ported it to Node. I mean, the first version of NPM is basically just a bunch of bash calls.
Sure.
It's just like subprocess, like to do things, because it was a port of a bash program. And so what I had to do was use a single file that's at the root of the folder called package.json. I borrowed that pattern from this program called C, which was in Narwhal, SEA, like,
Yeah.
the wet place. And what that let me do is I didn't have to like tell everybody how to structure their repos, right? Some people
Yeah.
had a main.js, some people had index.js, some people had lib/foo.js. I'm like, all right, I'm going to just I'm going to just like say, all right, you add one file into your root of your repo. It was before Travis CI had really caught on. Like people just didn't have they had like their program and their test and their README, and that was it.
Yep.
So usually not even a license file, because whatever, it's open source.
Who cares, right? Yeah.
Yeah. And so I sent I sent a whole bunch of pull requests in the early days to add package JSON files to all of the modules that people were sharing so that NPM could install them. And actually the initial version of the repo was or the initial version of the registry was one big JSON file in a GitHub repo. And it just had like a path and a name or a URL and a name for all of the things that it knew about. And I was like, well, this isn't going to scale, because now every time somebody needs to update their code, now I have to do a thing. I don't want to do things. I want to not do things. I want to just be consuming this stuff. So so we threw together Michael Rogers and I threw together a registry implementation on top of CouchDB that would just like, had real basic kind of CRUD operations to publish stuff. And and then after pretty short amount of time, maybe a couple of months of doing this, I started noticing, like, on the IRC channel, other people telling people, like, people would show up and say, hey, I just released this open source code that like is a module that runs on Node, and here's the 5 steps to install it. And somebody would be like, ugh, why don't you just publish this to NPM? Why are you making my life hard?
Sure.
So that kind of became the social pressure to do it that way. And adding one file to your repo didn't seem like a big deal at the time, because you didn't have 25 different top level files like license and contributing and .github now that has a whole bunch of other metadata inside. .travis CI, .yaml, whatever. I mean, now you go to any Git repo and it's like there's 20 things in the root. And if you actually want to look at, and then you click through to like the source or lib folder, and you notice it's like, oh, this is like a 10-line program, but there's 100, or like 1,000 lines of just like boilerplate wrapped around it.
Yeah. It's I think one of the things that's very, very interesting to me about NPM specifically, I honestly, like, I don't remember a time before NPM. I know that there was a time before NPM, but it's especially like in building JavaScript, like the idea with NPM, at least how I see it, and I imagine you kind of feel the same way, is like the reusability aspect of open source that's kind of like been one of the pillars of open source is really, really important, right? Like you mentioned, there are certain things that we shouldn't all have to build over and over and over again. So the ability to just say, hey, give me this thing like a shopping cart or logging framework or whatever, right? Like, if I had to rewrite that every single time, like, I would not have any time to get anything done. So being able to just pull like a well-known, or at least potentially publicly available package that does that, it makes my life as a developer substantially easier. When did you find out that it was going to be something that was used basically as the canonical? Obviously, there are other package managers. I don't want to downplay them. But, like, when did you find out, okay, this thing is basically taking over the world?
Well, it's a good question. I think, I don't know if there was like a moment when that shift happened, but, as JavaScript became more and more popular, it just seemed like more and more stuff was kind of accreting around Node. I think the first Node conf, there was like 1,200 packages in NPM. And then the second Node conf, it was like 10 times that, and then the next node comp was 10 times that again.
Yep.
So I think that growth has slowed down a little bit as we've just kind of reached saturation. But yeah, I mean, there's millions and millions of packages with billions of different version artifacts, because each one has like hundreds or thousands of releases a lot of times. And yeah, I think around last I looked, which was a couple years ago, was like something like 15 to 20 million users. Yeah, I don't know. You get to a point where it's like, yeah, and this happened a lot when I was at NPM Inc. Like people were like, "Oh my God, we crossed like 80 bazillion downloads in a day or something," and it's just like, all right, well, I've been watching this since it was like 7, right? Like I got excited when it was like, oh, somebody I don't know is signed up for NPM. Oh my God, this is amazing. We're blowing up. And then after a certain point, you just kind of get like oblivious to large numbers. Just like, oh, is it? I'd mention how there's like something millions of downloads, and people would be like, no, it's billions. Like, oh, whatever, what's the difference? Like
Well,
giant numbers.
Yeah,
whatever.
law of giant numbers is a real thing, right? Like I think too, like I tried to get like a definitive number of like how many packages are on NPM, right? And it's well over 1 million, right? And it's probably even more than, like, substantially more than that. But I think in general, like, it's one of those things where it's, at least in my brain, it's basically, it's a symbiotic relationship between NPM and Node, right? Like, I don't see a world where one lives without each other anymore, like, now. Like, it's your, like...
Yeah, and I think it's increasingly becoming a symbiotic relationship between NPM and JavaScript.
Sure, yeah.
I mean, Dino doesn't, Ryan Dahl has like famously said Dino doesn't use a package manager, but like, okay, but people still pull code, and they're mostly getting that code from NPM. So you kind of do use a package manager, you just are using it differently. Mm-hmm. I think that and there's things like unpackage and esm.sh, which are kind of like taking the NPM kind of corpus and using it in different ways, which is really exciting to see. Yeah, I just checked. It's like 1.99 million packages, so open source
2.
packages.
Yeah, almost 2.
Close to 2, yeah. And that's just like unique top level packages. So
yeah,
that number goes up. It goes down basically just when spammers get cleaned up
by
the support staff there.
Yeah, and I can only speak from a developer standpoint. Like, NPM has made my life substantially easier. It's also, unfortunately, made my life substantially harder, because now there's just too much stuff. Like, if you go to like npm.js, the website, and you search for like a package that you're looking for, like particular functionality, like a wrapper for, I don't know, some MongoDB controller or something like that. Like, you'll see like 15, 20, 30 different packages, and they're all very opinionated. And then you have to like go into each one of them and look at the last time a package was created, and then you look at the GitHub repository and look and see that, like, how often it's maintained. Like, that ceremony is, I'll be quite frank, it's sometimes exhausting, right? And I know there's nothing you can, like, NPM can do about that. I'd love to kind of get your thoughts about that.
I would argue that actually in the days before NPM, it was worse.
Sure.
We just didn't see as much of it.
Yeah.
So the difference was, and this is an interesting feature, I think, if you look at the barrier, the way that barriers shape behavior. So in some package ecosystems, the barrier to entry, the barrier to publishing is very, very high.
Sure.
Right? You have to, I mean, the one that kind of famously, like, to my mind, is like the most extreme example of this is Peckle and Pear in the PHP world, that kind of predated Composer. You had to literally fill out a form to reserve a namespace, and you had to have the code there and like submit the kind of the API description to the kind of council for approval. and then you would be granted this web space and this namespace, and if you didn't like provide an implementation within a certain amount of time, then they would like withdraw it, and you'd have to start the whole
Sure.
process over again. And this idea was like, we don't want any low quality code to be in pair. Like if you pull it from pair, it should be tested and reliable, and a sound API that anybody can use. It's like a consistent kind of thing across the entire corpus. And the stuff that was in there was generally very, very good. Like it had that effect, but it had the other effect of just there was nothing in there, right? Like it was like less than 1,000 modules after 5-10 years of operation. With NPM, and I found this a lot when I was at Yahoo. Like Yahoo had their own instance of pair
Sure.
that we would use internally, and we would just install things using Yinst. So it was like anybody could publish anything, like the barrier to publishing was very, very low internally. And so, yeah, there was a lot of junk, but also there was just a lot of stuff. And so it was more like, the other thing that happens that's really interesting is the higher the barrier to publishing, the more functionality that each published artifact has to deliver. Otherwise, it's not worth it, right? And the higher the barrier to discovery, again, has that same impact. So it's like in the days before NPM in open source JavaScript, well, the barrier to publish was pretty low.
Sure.
But the barrier to consumption and discovery was wildly high, right? You had to have a website. You had to like be shipping something that people could actually consume and use in whatever different way they wanted to do that. And you had to get people to come to your website, know about it, and then, convince them that it's okay to try it out and get them to kind of go through the hurdles of installing it in your like bespoke way. So, and like dependencies, forget about it. No dependencies would get installed for you by default. So as a result, you had things like YUI, like jQuery, that were very much like these kitchen sink
everything in one file. Yeah.
Frameworks. Yeah. And they were actually very, very big by today's JavaScript standards, even though the JavaScript bundles that we're shipping today are much, much larger, just because we can, not that we should. And so by reducing the friction to publishing and reducing the barrier to discovery and consumption, yeah, of course, there's like an explosion of functionality, which, I think if you ask anybody, like, is it better for there to be less functionality available through your package manager or more? Almost everybody will say, oh, yeah. No, it's definitely better for there to be more.
Yeah.
And then if you turn around and ask them like, okay, so is it better if the average quality is higher or if the average quality is lower? They'll say, oh, well, no, the quality's got to be kept really high. And it's like, okay, well, you just want your cake and eating it too. Like that's not, because those two things are in direct contradiction to one another.
No, I totally get that. I think the argument that like we were having this problem, it just wasn't as, I guess, out in the open, right? I think like to your point, like finding stuff before GitHub, before NPM, like that was challenging. And like forget about like upgrades. Like you went through like just the awareness process, right? Like what about the maintenance and the upgrade process? Like if I'm using a package,
oh my goodness, yeah.
Like good luck, like if I'm lucky to get somebody to download like version 1.0, like the chances of them going back and getting 1.2 or 1.5 or whatever, or even 2.0 if there's a breaking change, like good luck, right?
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that's benefited with NPM is that like this is constant state of, are you using the latest, or at least notifying folks that, hey, you could be taking advantage of some newer versions of this. Like that just in and of itself, which is a small feature of NPM, is substantially beneficial to the open source community. Like what were your thinking around like just trying to keep a living, breathing, I guess, document that represents all of the dependencies an application used? Was that something that you were thinking of initially with NPM, or is that something over the course of its origin or the organic growth of it, you're like, yeah, this needs to be like a living, breathing thing? Obviously, like package.lock.json, things like that kind of make things a bit more stable, but very much like the idea of being able to just, okay, NPM I, boom, latest, like based on my settings, newest version of everything every time.
Yeah, so I mean, having everything get installed with all the transitive deps and, you know, nesting in order to avoid like duplication conflicts and that kind of thing. That was always kind of in the original vision of NPM. My only gripe with, and this is actually something that YInst did really, really well when I was at Yahoo, that made it like a low friction, like easy kind of part of your development process, was you just like YInst install and it'll just find all the right things
Just
and
do it.
get
Yeah.
them all in the right places. Yeah. However, because we were building for PHP primarily, and also to some extent Perl and compiled bits, like when you YInst something, everything had to be squashed down to a top level namespace. And there are cases where that just can't be done, or where it can't be done in kind of polynomial time. And so as a result, you know, there would sometimes be cases where it's like, I install version A of, you know, or A at version 1, which depends on B, which depends on C, which depends on this other thing I've never heard of. And also I have this other thing, which depends on the same version of, you know, or an overlapping version of these things. But way, way, way down, like 4 layers in, there's this transitive depth that conflicts.
Sure.
Right. And it's something I've never heard of. It's a dependency of something I've never heard of. And now I'm in this state where I'm trying to figure out why the hell, like what even is NICU, and why does it need to have 2 different versions of it? Like, you know, and it would just always be such a pain. I think a lot of folks now don't really remember that experience,
Sure.
unless they work in other platforms that have that. But it ended up being a real big source of friction, and made it much harder to ship updates. You know, you had to be very careful that you didn't like break all of your downstream users by adding some, you know, dependency on something. So one of the goals with NPM from the get-go was like, let's make sure that can never happen.
Yeah.
Like there can never be a dependency hell situation. And it's actually been so successful that like that was the original meaning of the term dependency hell in like talking about software development or talking about package managers. Dependency hell was when you have 2 transitive dependencies that conflict with each other.
Yep.
And you don't even know why they're being pulled in. Like you've never heard of this thing. So you don't know. And sometimes the package manager will be like, oh, well, do you want version 1.0.1-7 or 1.0.2-9 of this thing you've never heard of? And it's like, I don't fucking know. Like just, you know?
Yeah. No, I mean,
and so that's, but now, like, because NPM solved that so well, and a lot of other package managers kind of copied some of the approaches, now dependency hell means, well, I have so many dependencies that like I can't even wrap my head around them because they're all so small and targeted, right? That like now dependency hell is just like, why do I have 4,000 dependencies? And again, you know, this gets down to like, well, you kind of get to choose which problem you have in terms of like how you design a package ecosystem or a module system, because if you make it easy to have multiple different versions of things all kind of living side by side, sometimes you're going to get multiple different versions of things living side by side, and they're going to be smaller because why not?
Yeah, I think also like just the thought of like, by the way, like you have to now deal with your, you know, your app having to download hundreds of megabytes for some of the more simpler problems that we're trying to solve. Like I jokingly say, like if you do create React app and then you npm install, you can like go and run all of your errands for the rest of the day, right? Like, and that's fine. I don't think that there's a problem with that. Go ahead.
It's gotten a little bit better, but sure.
Yeah.
I think the bigger thing, you know, where there's still a ton of ceremony, like npm install isn't that bad, and you know, there's even ways we could probably still make it better. But the thing that I see going on that where I feel like there's still like a lot of kind of growing pains happening and it hasn't quite settled is like just sort of like, I don't know, it used to be very easy to like write a program with some kind of like nice templating, like routing logic to say, this is the HTML I'm shipping,
Yep.
right? And then you would write your client side bits that would like spruce it up,
Yeah.
with CSS or JavaScript or whatever. And now I feel like that kind of, like layered semantic approach, or like, progressive enhancement type of approaches or whatever, are kind of like old hat. I think a lot of the activity is around like, okay, you know what? Like what you have is a like div ID equals app. That's your HTML, and then you ship a JavaScript bundle that has everything.
Yeah.
And it's not good. I don't think it's good to do it that way. I think, and I think that like, or I hope at least, the tide is turning a little bit. I do still see a lot of apps kind of built and shipped that way, but there's things like Remix is one. It's the one that I've kind of been using a lot lately, where it's sort of focused on server side rendering. Or the flip side of that, if you don't ship div ID equals app, then you're building an entire static application, and anything dynamic has to be either like pre-rendered or handled on the client, right? Which is good. I mean, that's how I generate my blog that I just push into the CDN, right?
Yeah. You can't live in a world without you can't live in a world without server-side rendering if you want any sort of presence on the internet, right? Like
right. And like there's just cases where like I'm showing an app catalog that I'm fetching from a database. Like I can't pre-render that because there's billions of items or whatever. Like so I think there are some really interesting approaches that I feel like are, after 10 years are just now getting to like kind of wrapping their heads around like, what are some good approaches to doing this kind of layered progressive enhancement, using things like JavaScript and React, which do provide some pretty interesting and very good kind of developer ergonomics. And then how do we minimize how much actually gets shipped down to the browser, with a minimum of ceremony for the users. So the way Remix goes about it is with this kind of path-based nested layout approach. There's a framework that they say it's not ready for prime time, but it looks pretty compelling, called Fresh. That's kind of in Dino. And so that's another approach that might work at some point, but that definitely has kind of a lot of similarities to Remix, but also doesn't do any kind of pre-building or pre-compiling of any TypeScript or React code. It's just 100% server-side generated for every request, but has a similar kind of just structure your app like this, and we will turn these things into routes for you.
Yeah, the transition has been very interesting of like, we want, like, I think you mentioned this pretty eloquently, like we want all the features in the box, but also we don't want to pay for all the features in the box, right?
And also the box should be small.
Yes. And it needs to run on every single device that's ever been created that has access to the internet, right? Without it taking up 75% of the CPU at any point in time. I'd love to kind of get your thoughts too. Like there's, you see there, like you mentioned CDN, like there's so many options out there for folks to host packages. And one of the ways a lot of folks host packages, they're like, I don't want to deal with NPM. I'm just going to post a bundled version or a minified version of my package out on some CDN, and then you just put that in the head of your HTML page, and then you just interact with it using these particular steps. And that's kind of like, at least in my memory, like jQuery was like, that was it. Like that was the way that you got a hold of jQuery. Now you can do other things, right? I'd kind of love to get your thoughts as like, is there a happy medium between using like a full-fledged package manager and a CDN? Can you do both effectively without causing problems? Do you kind of have to make a decision about how you want to access additional functionality for when you build apps? I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
Um,
Be as opinionated as you like, since you wrote npm, obviously. But
yeah, I mean, I think, even not like putting aside my bias or connection, like I don't. It's not like I'm getting a nickel every time somebody uses npm.
yeah,
I'm totally out of it now. But I would say, yeah, just like publish it to the package manager and let the package manager figure it out,
yeah,
or let other things sort of hook onto that, right? We have this hub. Um, and you kind of get some nice CDN type features for free, right? If you want to fetch just the tarball, like, good news, that's a globally distributed CDN that's being
hmm,
fetched from. If you want to fetch some of the contents, there are things like, there are CDNs that are out there, like Unpackage or
yep,
ESMSH, that you could just fetch the contents from. Like, you don't need to be like, it's not like, oh, I don't want to deal with npm, I just want to like send it to a CDN. Like, that's actually harder. Just
yeah,
just put a package manager, put a package JSON in there, type npm publish. Like, now it's on all the CDNs.
yeah.
It's kind of the easiest way to go about it.
Yeah, like the CDN, there's so many CDN aggregators out there too, where it's just their sole business model is just scraping npm.js, right? npmjs.org, and just literally just finding the files that need to be surfaced, right? So you can reference them without the package manager. So it's basically, like you said, it's the same thing. It's just, I
Mm-hmm.
guess, one step ahead instead of, because I think that there is, to my point a bit earlier, like there is a lot of ceremony to like the whole npm install process, even though, like you said, it is getting substantially better. I do agree there. But some people don't feel like they don't need all the flexibility that npm provides. Like, oh, I don't want to minify. I don't want to have to minify my stuff. I don't want to have to configure something like Webpack. Like, that's a whole thing we didn't really talk about, right? Um,
Yeah, I think the big opportunity for reducing complexity and reducing ceremony in the web development space these days is like, how do I turn my um, how do I turn the code I'm writing into a thing that a browser is running?
yeah,
And like, there's a lot of transpilation and stuff, and like, web components are kind of native in the browser, but there's really no like server side rendering approach with web components that works
yeah,
at all. So if you want to do a progressive enhanced kind of site, like, you end up going with something like Vue or JSX or whatever.
yeah.
Um, so yeah, I think, at least, like, there are some good kind of frameworks out there that are sort of using, or abstracting out the like Webpack or ESBuild kind of stuff for you. So that's one thing that's nice about Remix and Fresh and others kind of in that vein, is that um, they're somewhat opinionated, but also just like, they just do it and just make it work.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of goes back to the very, very beginning of our conversation, right? Where it's like sometimes you just need to be able to get the job done, right?
Hmm.
And whatever's going to get you to that the fastest, right? Like we all, if at least in tech, if we're an engineer or developer, like a PM or somebody else is always going to ask, like, when is this going to be done? And if you can give them an answer that's shorter, they're always going to be happier, and you're probably going to be happier too, right? So like pick the option that is going to get your job done the fastest.
Yep.
Awesome. Well, we're at the top of the hour, and I really appreciate, Isaac, you coming on and chat with me about all sorts of different things in the open source world. Do you have anything parting that you'd like to say, or definite things, maybe things that you're working on, or things that musings that you've came across?
Um, Yeah, so what I'm working on now, I'll give you just a 2-second pitch. It's called Tier, Tier.run. We are basically a tool um, for SaaS companies to implement their pricing with a single source of truth, so that they don't have to go through as much difficulty or pain and suffering when it's time to change their pricing and when it's time to sort of stand it up initially. The idea being that you can very seamlessly and safely handle all of the, grandparenting and changes and figuring out which user is on which plan, and changing which plan is kind of the thing that users get when they sign up, without breaking all of the reports and hooks and everything that the rest of your company works on. Because we sort of I think pricing is such a weird black art, and once it's there, it becomes almost impossible to change.
Yeah, and I mean, I could definitely, like, I think whenever you make a purchase on the internet, you really have no idea how much you're paying until your credit card bill gets hit, right? Like, that's what's amazing about the internet, is that, like, especially like as you use more if you use consumption-based services, like, you just go about your day and they're like, oh, like, I guess this is how much I use this, which is really important. For folks that might be interested in learning more about Tier.run is the website name, you said?
Yep. It's still kind of in stealth mode at this moment, but not for long.
Okay. Well, I think a lot of people will be excited to hear about some of the capabilities that you're looking to build there. So awesome. So check that out, Tier.run, if you have any interest in learning more. As we wrap up, I'd love to ask my guests one final question, and that question is, if you can kind of summarize your thoughts on open source, tech in general, the community that's built around it, and you only had one word to do so, what would that word be for you?
I only had one word.
You can cheat a little bit. I let people cheat. It's okay. But, like, it's always good to kind of, the words that some of the people come up with.
Gosh. Yeah, I got nothing. I can't summarize that in one word.
The answer, Isaac's word is nothing. So, like,
it's complicated.
Yeah, complicated is great. I think that's like I think we've gone to complicated a few times, and I think there is something safe to say about we wouldn't exist as software engineers if the problems we were trying to solve to some degree weren't complicated. So technology has to be complicated to help us, right? I think that's fine. Complicate's a good one.
Yeah, I kind of mean it more as an unfortunate thing, but yeah, I guess you're right. Like, if the problems weren't hard, then somebody would have already solved them by now.
Sure. Awesome. Well, Isaac, thank you so much for coming on the show and chatting with me. For the folks tuning in, definitely thank you as well for listening in and watching. If anybody wants to chat more, Coffee and Open Source Conversations, coffeeandopensource.com. I'm Isaac Levin. Thank you again to the other Isaac, the more famous Isaac. And enjoy the rest of your day, everybody. Take care.
Cheers.